Welcome back to another episode of ROC Boys Football, continuing with our 2022 season preview. As we take a look at the Baylor Bears, this is one of my brother's most favorite team heading into 2022. If you guys are Baylor Bear fans, you guys are going to enjoy this one because it's probably just going to be pretty much just a hype train talking Baylor Bears football. Before we get into it, though, just wanted to say thank you guys for all the support you guys have shown the channel. We appreciate it. We love talking ball with you guys in the comment section. And if you guys do like the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Dale, I'm going to kick it off to you. Let's start on the offensive side of the football and maybe talk a little program trajectory. What do you think of what Dave Aranda's doing with this Baylor program here?
I mean, anyone who doesn't think he's doing like a phenomenal job is like nuts. And I guess the one knock people would probably make on him, he's not an elite recruiter, and that's probably a fair statement. It's not like he's bringing in monster classes or even classes that are commensurate with the play they put on the field. But there's like multiple ways to win in this game, and he just develops talent as well as anybody I've ever seen, and that program as a whole does. So I want Dave Aranda to coach the teams I root for. Like, if Jim Harbaugh were to ever leave, I'd want Dave Aranda hired the next day. So I guess that's like the nicest thing I could say about him.
Yeah, I was really surprised that he didn't go anywhere, and I think that just speaks to he wants to build this Baylor program up. Because if I'm Michigan, if I'm Ohio State, and I need to hire a college football coach, I'm going out. Dave Aranda is my first call. What he's done with Baylor is phenomenal. So looking at 2022, let's start on the offense side of the ball. This team is getting a little disrespected by the media. I can see why personally, because it's not that flashy. The skill players that are coming back aren't great. They're largely unproven on both sides of the ball. But really, this Baylor Bears team is going to thrive in the trenches because that offensive line and defensive line are full of absolute horses. Let's start with the quarterback here in Blake Shapen, which I'll note, really impressive by Dave Aranda to let Bohannon know that he's not going to be the starter. It's his last year of eligibility, letting him go test the water somewhere else. He ends up at USF. That's really, really cool. Not a lot of head coaches would do that. But Blake Shapen, we saw a little bit of him towards the end of the year, Dill. What do you think about Blake Shapen heading into 2022 here?
I'm personally a Shapen fan. I thought he played really well against Oklahoma State in the Big 12 title game for the most part. A good athlete. I think he's underrated. Like, he threw some really nice passes. A couple just didn't get completed, but like a handful of really good passes. And again, I'm like an Aranda we trust guy. So if you think he could beat out Bohannon, who frankly, I think at times really didn't throw the ball well enough. I think you look back to that TCU game, like that's just not good enough. And I don't know. So at the end of the day, if you think there's higher upside with Shapen and his ability to throw it, and I don't think you're taking that much of a step back athletically, because Shapen can move pretty well. I think it's the right call. Go with him because at the end of the day, Bohannon wasn't asked to do much, and when he was, I don't think he came through for them.
What I think what this fueled his decision was how efficient Shapen is. I mean, completed 17 of his first 17 passes in the Big 12 championship game against an elite defense in Oklahoma State. Big thing that jumps out is obviously not a big sample size, but 0 interceptions. Bohannon threw 7 interceptions. Baylor, they butter their bread with turnover margin. I mean, Baylor was plus 13 in turnovers. That's third nationally. Blake Shapen's a guy that you feel pretty efficient about. You feel pretty good about his efficiency and his ability to not turn the ball over. And I think that's what got him the nod. And he's just going to continue to progress as a thrower. He looked good in the spring game. I think the big question that a lot of people have is, how are you going to replace some of those skill guys? Let's start with the running back spot, because Abram Smith and even Tristan Ebner gave that Baylor Bears team. That's how their offense ran through Abram Smith, who was one of the best running backs in the country last year. I actually really like what they're bringing back. Tay McWilliams is kind of that bigger body guy who I think can play that Abram Smith role. But Dill, keep an eye on this guy. Flashed in the spring game. And if he can stay healthy, I think Baylor Bear fans have been waiting for this guy to break out. Craig Squirrel Williams. I don't know why they call him Squirrel, but you watch him run the ball, I think you get a pretty good idea of why they call him Squirrel. Absolutely elite with the football in his hands. Really, really twitchy here.
Yeah, and they're going to need one of them to step up, because that Baylor offense ran through, grounding teams down. I mean, Ebner and Abram Smith were both big, physical but fast guys, and they just beat people up. I mean, no one wanted to tackle them. They were moving piles pretty consistently. That offensive line, as you mentioned, was really good, and they're bringing that back. But that running game is going to have to somehow work because I think that's just how Baylor plays offense. And I don't see them spreading it out and playing like the traditional Big 12 way. I think they're going to want to get back to it. And yeah, he's obviously three very unproven players, but it's not to say they're bad because just because they didn't get snaps from the other two who were stallions, no one would have gotten snaps in front of them.
Quite frankly, I, as a 5'8" who can barely run under a 5-second 40-yard dash, could run behind that offensive line because it's going to be elite. Before we get to the offensive line, though, the wide receivers are another big question mark. They were extremely reliant on Tyquan Thornton. He accounted for over 33% of their receiving yards last year. He's out the door, as well as RJ Sneed, their second leading passer. Ben Sims is their third returner and the number one returner in passing yards. But as a term of wide receiver position, there's a lot of unproven guys that if you watch the spring game, you feel pretty good about. I'll start throwing out Monterey Baldwin and Gavin Holmes. Gavin Holmes, a guy who has torn his ACL twice. It's a lot of unproven pass catchers, but I think they can hit some explosives with some of these guys who are largely unproven, but they're really good athletes and they're really good with the ball in their hands.
And that's what they're going to need to do because they're not going to throw it that often. But that's one thing they kind of did last year was hit some big plays. And I think Bohannon left a few on the table, which is probably part of this decision.
Yeah.
But they're going to need to hit those plays if they want to take that step into being maybe more of a playoff team than just a really good Big 12 team. And yeah, it's hard to say with these wideouts because, again, you're losing two really good players. It's not to say they can't replace them, but one of them is going to have to step up, play some good football.
Jeff Grimes does a phenomenal job. We probably should have mentioned him to start. He does a really good job of just creating easy throws for his quarterback. And if they can establish that run game, we talked about the explosive plays. That'll come. When teams have to start bringing both safeties in the box to defend the run, Blake Shapen is a guy who can make that throw over the top. And you got a couple guys who really, really can stretch the field vertically. I think that's how they'll find their explosive plays.
And I will say those tight ends are pretty good.
Yes.
Yeah, both Sims and Dabney. They both played really good football. Dabney maybe look a little more athletic. Will Sims is the kind of more the traditional
linebacker. Yep.
And catch the ball in the middle of the field, not necessarily deep passes or intermediate throws, but he'll be a dependable target, which is obviously nice getting him back.
And then the offensive line, we don't need to touch on them.
Hammers.
They're absolute hammers. Connor Galvin's a guy that I'm extremely excited for to do some evaluating for the 2023 NFL draft. He's an absolute bear who's got pretty good feet for how big he is. Then you got Jacob Gall in the middle, and then a 6-year senior at the right tackle spot. I'm very optimistic that this is how this Baylor team is going to win football games in the Big 12.
I mean, that was an interior line that could push people around, and they're obviously losing 55, who is a good player. But to get four guys back who all four played, I'd say, at a very high level is that'll be really helpful for this Baylor team because they're going to need to run the ball, as we mentioned.
There's not a lot of Big 12 teams that are going to want to try to stop the run 30, 40 times a game.
The only team that could was Oklahoma, and Oklahoma was kind of loaded in their front last year. It's they caused some problems because Oklahoma was freaky athletic, I'd say, on the D-line.
Yep.
And that maybe didn't square as well with the zone. They were just giving up a lot of penetration, but when they played Oklahoma State, they were blowing them around. And you just got to think this team coming back, there's very few D lines that can, I think, bang with them at the level Oklahoma kind of did, who was the only team who I think challenged them.
So looking at the defense side of the ball, this is how this team was so good. Dave Aranda and what he did with this defense and Ron Roberts, this defense was awesome. It was a blast to watch, but they lose some guys that were really, really important to this defense, starting with Jalen Petrie, who just played the star position phenomenally. Terrell Bernard was a rangy linebacker, and then they lose a ton of guys in the secondary, JT Woods, Kalen Barnes. It's a depleted team, but I think this team, kind of like Oklahoma State, is a very scheme-specific team. They are good at defense, not necessarily because they have the phenomenal athletes, but because they run a damn good defense, and Dave Aranda does a good job at disguising blitzes, and just putting opposing quarterbacks.
And what you failed to mention in your little diatribe against this Baylor Bears defense is they're getting back basically their whole defensive line, and that unit's like very good. I mean, Siaki Ika and Hall in the middle that's probably one of the best D tackle tandems in the country, I'd say. And know who I really want to keep an eye on and I want to see more is Matt Jones coming off the edge. They played him off ball a little bit last year, but when you saw him coming on the edge, he looked like he could be a really good pass rusher. And then you got other guys. I think 55 is a very good edge rusher too, as is Bryson Jackson. So you're kind of loaded at defensive line across the board.
And don't forget about the 4-star transfer Jackson player who was awesome at Tulsa. This interior defensive line is just a full of dogs. There's not many teams. Siaki Ika is a guy that you just can't block. He's just an absolute force. And then if Jackson players on the 2 deep and the offensive guards are tired of blocking Ika, they have to go deal with Jackson player who's a fire.
And you can roll in Cole Maxwell, who's
really deep,
really good player. TJ Franklin, really good player. You're just really stacked on defensive line, and a defensive line that caused a lot of teams problems.
Yeah.
You know they can play.
And I think the depth is gonna really stand out too. Now, the back end of the defense, the backers, you lose Terrell Bernard, and then you obviously lose some guys in the secondary. They're inexperienced, but
Dylan Doyle coming back.
He's very good.
I thought he played very good football. And what I'll add about the linebackers is you kind of got a list of guys who we talked about as edge rushers. One of those guys I would think is athletic enough and functional because they all kind of did play a little bit throughout the field, if you will, where sometimes they were back in more of a traditional backer role. I would think one of them could be able to step in and take that Terrell Bernard role. And granted, Terrell Bernard was good, but he's nowhere near the loss Jalen Petrie was. He's not irreplaceable like that. Jalen Petrie was like incredible.
And you get Josh White through the transfer portal from LSU, who I do think can be that type of athlete that Terrell Bernard was too. So they have the guys that I think can step up at the linebacker spot. The secondary position is probably where you feel the most uncomfortable. You have the most question marks. You noted Jalen Petrie, a guy that just did everything. I loved him in the 2022 NFL draft. He's a guy that lined up pretty much anywhere in the field, extremely disruptive behind the line of scrimmage. Leonardo Johnson looked kind of the part. He's got the twitchy athleticism that you want at that star spot, and that's a very important position for Baylor. You saw everything they did with Jalen Petrie and how successful they were with Jalen Petrie. Leonardo Johnson's a guy to keep your eye on at that star position. I thought he looked really, really good in the spring game. He got his hands on a few footballs. Hopefully he can kind of fill that void. And then the back end, yes, it's hard to lose a guy like JT Woods who had, 5 interceptions last year. Kalen Barnes, extremely good cornerback in the Big 12, but your secondary can get masked up if you have a very, very good defensive line where teams can't just drop back and throw the football. Like there will not be
frankly,
many
like Al Walcott and Mark Milton both played pretty good football. Like they weren't Kalen Barnes last year. Granted, I think Al Walcott could play that at that level. He seemed like he's got the bones to be if he makes just some progress and he could get to that level. And I'm not saying their secondary is going to be better, but like their defensive line, I think might be one of the best in the country. And you have Dave Aranda, and I'm just a Dave Aranda I trust on defense. I think you trot out a high school team, and he could.
They're going to be a damn good defense if they're coached by Dave Aranda. I can't argue with that. And looking at their schedule, they're a little disrespected by Vegas, only setting their win total at 7.5. They do have a difficult schedule, specifically out of conference, because you go on the road and play BYU, we're very high on BYU in that game. That's a Red Sharpie game. I'm extremely excited to watch that game.
That's a fun one. That's a late night. Love to see it. That's going to be rocking in BYU. It's going to be an incredible game. I'm very excited.
It's one of the better offenses you'll see in the country, led by Jaron Hall, against one of the better defenses you'll see in the country in Baylor, coached by Dave Aranda.
It's a little good on good.
It's a good on good matchup. If they can come out of this win with BYU and get out of that out-of-conference schedule 3-0, there's not a lot of teams that I'm clearly picking to beat them in the Big 12. And
they clear the win total easy if they beat BYU.
I think a lot of the teams are a lot of media in Vegas are kind of underrating this team because they're not flashy. They're not a team like Oklahoma that's going to be super flashy with their quarterback and wide receiver play. Baylor's just going to run the ball down your throat, and they're going to play good defense. And quite frankly, Iowa State, I would be surprised if they gave Baylor any trouble. I'm not very high on Oklahoma State. We just did their preview. On the road at West Virginia, Kansas, Texas Tech, and then you get your really tough schedule. You go on the road and play in Norman. You get Kansas State and TCU at home, and then finishing out, and you got to circle this game. Friday on the road at Texas, that's probably going to be a game that's going to get you to the Big 12 championship game there.
Talk about good on good. That's going to be something. Although they're not – I would think Baylor might be able to just keep the ball for an entire game and not give it up one time because they'll just smash that.
I'll tell you what, that's a horrible matchup for Texas, I think, on the offense side of the ball too because, dude, Texas ain't going to be able to block Baylor. They're just not. If there's any question on that offense for Texas, it's their offensive line. It is very, very leaky. They're going to go up against the most physical defensive line you'll see in the country in the Baylor Bears. That game is going to be extremely fun too. That'll do it for a 2022 season preview on the Baylor Bears. Before we get out of here, because of all the support you guys have shown the podcast, we do have a presenting sponsor. Support for ROC Boys football is brought to you by Manscaped, who is the best in men's below-the-waist grooming. Their products are precision-engineered tools for your family jewels. Manscaped's Performance Package, the ultimate men's hygiene bundle. Join over 4 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped with this exclusive offer for you. 20% off and free worldwide shipping with the code ROCBOYS at manscaped.com. Guys, use the right tools for the job. Manscaped's an absolute game changer down there for all you guys. And it's a great present if you're a girlfriend for your boyfriend. So, guys, 20% off at Manscaped, free shipping, and 20% off with code ROCBOYS. We appreciate your support, and we're going to talk to y'all later.